we need to commit to diversity. How do we make this commitment to diversity? Well, one is we need to define what we mean by it. What does it mean to be diverse? It means you just look like the country or the world you live in. Like you should see all those faces represented in your company. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't mean it doesn't come without tension. It'll make you uncomfortable. And that's okay, because that's normal. Because I would also say when people feel included, they'll speak up, and that's important. And that's why there's tension when you have diversity, because when people feel empowered to speak up, it means they're going to challenge what you think, and that's going to be important. And you're going to need that to have a successful company. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute, too. But that's how those two are connected. One is you should look like the world you live in. And two, when people feel empowered, they'll speak up. And that's how you're going to grow your company. The Kapor Capital came up with some founders' commitments. And Techstars has committed to those commitments, and it's based on a simple acronym of GIVE. Goals, invest. 3 is you should volunteer and educate. And so I'll just dive a little deeper into each one of these and give you some context of how that works. So one is you should set goals. Your company should have a commitment. You should set some goals. But what should those goals be? One is commit to diversity. I know it sounds very simple, but it's actually more complicated than you think. And the reason you should commit to diversity is the way I got my last 3 jobs. As I mentioned, I've worked in healthcare, sports, Techstars, and almost every one of those companies started their diversity program the same way. What did? They decided, you know what? Diversity is important. Let's put together a committee. And then after a year, they decided, you know what? This isn't getting it done. We have a committee, but nothing's getting done. And the reason not, because they haven't assigned a leader. And so I realized for a lot of companies, they might say, you know what? I'm too small, can't do it. But the point is, you got to make a commitment and you got to choose somebody to be responsible for it. And I'm sure all of you already know, if someone's not responsible for it, it does not get done. As part of your company commitment, you should collect data. Now, a lot of times people will probably think, you know, what do you mean collect data? There's only 6 of us here. I don't know why I would need any more data than that. Well, the point is you should know who your customers are just the same, right? Because one of the things you might find when you start collecting data is that, wow, we found that women hate our product, but men love it. And I look around, I'm looking at 6 guys. That might explain why your customers, maybe half the world, which are female, don't like your product, right? And so that's why it's very important to collect data. Not only should you know who's in the room, but who's consuming your product. And do they like your product? Because it could create a huge opportunity for you. You know, the world's changing. It's much more global. And you should have a company that's dynamic and take advantage of that. And by collecting your data, you know who your consumer is, right? Not only do you know who's in the room, but who are you going to sell to who's not in the room? Invest. And this is one of my favorite sayings is audio should match video. What you say should look like what you do. And so in your diversity and inclusion work, you should make sure audio matches video. And what's a simple way to do that? Compensation. We've known for years that women are underpaid. So you should just, from day one, make sure audio matches video. And how do you do that? You make sure that you can prove it. And one of the ways you prove it is just pay people fairly. And that should also be reflected in your code of conduct, in your mission, in your vision about whatever your company is, that should be reflected there. Techstars has done the same thing. We've upgraded our code of conduct, and you'll see that compensation is in there. And we did that because it was very important in my mind that audio matches video, that what you say looks like what you do. And we know in compensation, it's not just salary. In all the different forms of compensation, you should make sure that it's equitable and you can prove it. And that's a simple way to do that, because when you do that, you start building a culture of inclusion. If I feel empowered, that I've been paid fairly, I will do whatever it takes to support the company. But if I feel like, you know, from day one, they never paid me fairly, they don't, you know the rules, support what they say, audio doesn't match video, it's hard to create a company of inclusion. It's hard to create a company where people speak up when things aren't going so well. And there's a consequence for that when things aren't going so well. And we'll talk about that too. So this is how we're going to build this foundation around diversity and inclusion, how it's directly connected to the work that you're going to do and the businesses that you're building. So the other piece is volunteer. You know, if you're going to recruit from diverse communities, you should also volunteer and give back to those communities, because that's equally as important. And by doing that, you start building a diverse network. Because one of the challenges I typically find is people say, well, you know, my network's not very diverse, so it's hard for me to recruit, and I'm moving fast. Well, that's why you got to build your network all the time. And there's different ways to do that. One is you should volunteer and support. And this is what I want to point out, because this is going to lead into this unconscious bias. Because a lot of times when we talk about volunteering, we think, oh, I'll go to this poor community and we'll go save those black folks. No, it's more complicated than that. And you shouldn't be working from this stereotype. The fact of the matter is you could give back by going to a women in engineering program and be supportive there and mentoring. You could go to a minority entrepreneurs, startup weekend and volunteer there and be equally supportive. and not assume that that means, these communities are poor and I'm going to go save them. You should be disabused of that assumption. That is not what we're asking you to do. The fact of the matter is you should network and not go into any community with an assumption of what they can and cannot do. The other thing I would say is partner with organizations. I told you I came out of the university system. Almost every university in the US, every major university has a chief diversity officer. So you could just simply reach out to them so that they know when you have a job opportunity, they know when you're recruiting, and that's a simple thing you can do to start diversifying your network and investing in your network. The other thing I would do to build a diverse network is I would hire a Avila. I worked at a hospital system. We had this incredible CEO, but what I loved about him is just the way he did business. And I went to Avila, who was the president of one of the hospitals, African-American woman who'd done very well. And I just remember like, how'd you get this job? Like, how'd you get into Integris? And she said, Stan recruited me years ago. She said, I was working for another hospital, a competing hospital. I was doing a presentation, and when I was done, Stan came up to me and said, you're amazing, I'm gonna hire you. She said, literally, that's how we started the conversation. She said, we exchanged cards, and she said, 3 years later, my phone rang. It was Stan. He said, I got a hospital, you're gonna be the president of it. And she said, that's pretty much how it happened. And to me, that's how you build a network. But what was interesting on top of that is the hospital she went to was in a very white suburb of Oklahoma City, probably the whitest suburb. Because the point wasn't so much that, we have a diverse community, now I gotta have a minority leader. It was like, no, when I have a great leader, you can put them anywhere. And your commitment to diversity should reflect that. And that was what's so amazing about what he did and what each of you can do is as you're out and you're networking and building that network, when you see great people, just make note. That's how you build a network. That's how you find great people. So you got a network to recruit. Go find your Avila. Another thing that's simple, just go to conferences. There's a lot of conferences around issues around gender, around race, entrepreneurship, and you should be there and be visible because that's how you're going to build your network. Because these conferences also help you educate. And that's the E in give, is like, how are you educating yourself? And so if you're out going to these events, learning, you're educating yourself, you're getting a better understanding of the different concepts around diversity and inclusion. And one of the things you're probably going to learn about is unconscious bias. Like we hear this all the time, like unconscious bias, what does it mean? How does it impact us? And so one of the things you can do, there's a link here to the Harvard Implicit Bias website. And you can just go onto that website, you log in, and there's this little exercise you do by punching a couple keys. And typically most people go and it'll tell you if you have a racial bias or a gender bias. And almost everybody I know who's ever done it typically says, I took the test, said I had a racial bias, I don't think it's true. And I'm like, well, that's why it's called unconscious, right? Obviously you don't think it's true, or we wouldn't call it unconscious bias, right? But if you think about it, that's typically how it works. Like you don't know you have these things. But there's a sad reality too in unconscious bias is, I took the test myself and it said I had a bias against Black people. And I was thinking, what the hell? I've been doing diversity my whole life. I clearly am Black. How is this even possible? But then it made perfect sense if you think about it. And this is the hardest thing about raising children of color is you internalize these negative biases about yourself and you don't even know you're doing it. And so you can imagine if I have a 7-year-old, the things that go through their mind and how because if you think about it, we're consuming the same television. So if white people are getting negative images of Black people are getting them too and internalizing. And that was the hardest thing about raising my kids was to try to help them negotiate that reality of getting these negative images, internalizing it, and then how do you undo that? Very painful, as you can imagine as a parent sometimes, the conversations that I have with my kids. And unconscious bias is a major piece of that because they don't even know where it comes from, and I can't explain it either. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space. At least the first thing you can do is understand what biases you have because we all have them. I have this truck because it's a good example of how unconscious bias works. And this is my daughter from years ago. And I remember when we saw the truck, I look at my wife and right away I was like, we ain't going to that event. And she agreed with me. She's like, no, we will not be going to that event right away. We both agreed, right? And then I thought, holy cow, I've been doing diversity for years. There's something going on here. I shouldn't just blurt that out, right? But because I knew there's a reason I wasn't going to go. And I got another bias too. Any country music fans in here? Raise your hand if you country music fans, okay? There's a connection I make, right? I would assume country music, if you drive that big truck, you probably don't like Black people. Right? I'm connecting those things. And I imagine many of you have made those same connections, right? Now, I would also assume when you got up this morning, you didn't go, the goal today is discrimination. I'm going to start discriminating right now. Like no one does that, do you? Right? But typically what happens is you take a shortcut. Our unconscious biases are shortcuts through the world. And so let's assume today I decided, we need to hire another person in our diversity program. And you get that interview. And on the morning of the interview, I pull in the parking lot with my little Honda Accord. I get out and you pull in that big truck. You got that country music blaring, right? Do you think I'm going to hire you? Yes or no? How many people think I'm going to hire you? Probably not, right? But the reason I don't hire you isn't because I go, oh, I'm going to discriminate today. I start using code words. What's a big code word I use? Fit. Think about it. If there's two top candidates and you're not sure who to take, the next thing somebody's going to blurt out is, who's the best fit? Let's pick the person who fits the best. We always say that. And you don't have to define fit, but every single person in the room knows what it is. And you think it is, all that is a definition of what your biases are. And you'll start reproducing those. And so that's how our unconscious bias impacts on a daily basis the decisions we make. So it's important to know you have your biases and to start having a conversation about fit. What does fit mean? Because you're reproducing those biases. And there's a consequence for that. When people feel included, they also feel empowered to speak up. So when I worked in healthcare, I remember one of the major problems they had were medical errors. And they found this disturbing problem is that a doctor would literally be making a mistake in the emergency room or in the OR, and the nurses would see it and wouldn't say a word. And other people in the room would know that this is wrong and they would not say a word. And I remember at one point, this wasn't at our hospital when I worked in the hospital, but there was this literally star athlete at a university, and they went in to repair his ankle, and they repaired the wrong ankle. And you'd have to think, how's that possible? Because you would think you'd open it up and everything looks good, you leave it alone. But they in fact began injuring this ankle. And so the reason fit is a cost to your company is if people don't feel like they're included and valued, they won't speak up, and they'll let you make these most horrible mistakes. And for your company, there's a cost in that. And so if you think about it, and I gave the example, there's a monster truck, and I look at my wife and I say, we ain't going to that, and she agrees with me. Think about that, right? She immediately allowed me to reproduce this bias against people I don't even know, this assumption I'm making about a truck and country music. She just helps me reproduce that. And it's not that she's a terrible person, but it's what happens when you always hire to fit. The people never question it. If you don't empower your employees to feel included, they won't speak up, they won't challenge it. And I would argue, no matter what the size of your company is, you can't afford that kind of mistake. You can't have a room full of people who all just nod their head at you, never feel empowered to question what you're going to do and what's happening in the organization.